So, opening this discussion is Dr. Miranda Kaufmann, historian and author. Miranda, over to you.
Hello everyone, great to be here, and I'm delighted to be in discussion today with Professor Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, author of Back to Black, A History of Black Radicalism, and most recently The New Age of Empire, which shows how riddled our daily lives and the world is with those legacies of colonialism that he argues aren't even over. So hello, Kehinde.
Hi, afternoon, I guess. Yeah, afternoon.
About we meet at noon.
Yeah.
So I thought what we should really do, like in quite a geeky academic way, is define our terms, like I was always taught to in an essay. But I think that a lot of people have actually misunderstood and sometimes willfully misrepresented what is meant by decolonising education. So I thought I'd start by just asking you how you would define it.
Well, I think there's a two-part answer to that. So I think decolonising decolonizing is a process which talks about properly overturning, and in the context of the university, that would mean far more than curriculum and far more than a couple of courses. That actually means really thinking about what the university is. I actually don't think that's what we're generally doing when we have this conversation, which I think is why you get some of the misunderstanding. Because what we're really talking about mostly in the sector is diversifying it, really. So it is about bringing in different knowledge. It is about saying, well, let's understand the world better. Because the reality is that the knowledge that we get in universities is completely Eurocentric, whitewashed, and it's such a partial view of the world that it's just bad. And so really what we're trying to do is just say, well, let's just understand the world fully, which isn't really a radical thing to do. It should just be quite a sensible thing, I would have thought.
Yeah, so and I'm also interested. I think a lot of the discussion with education as well is about schools education as well, which obviously has a symbiotic relationship with what happens in universities. But obviously, you're coming at it from the university perspective, and whereas I've been working more with teachers recently and like been involved in that discussion as well. That and I think a lot of the most impassioned rhetoric is also around, what we teach our children in a kind of, starting from scratch. And I actually had this situation last term when my 6-year-old daughter, was sent some homeschooling homework, and it was a comparison between Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria. And it went on about the assassination attempts, how many children they had, or whether they were married or not. All of that. And I was like, why does nobody point out the key difference here is that Queen Victoria ruled over a global empire? No mention at all. Whereas Elizabeth I's power on the global stage, minuscule in comparison. And I tried to complain about it to Twinkle, who created this resource. And then again, they willfully misunderstood, or just certainly misunderstood, and thought that I was upset about the mention of death and assassination. And I was like, no, my kids are fine with that, beheading, no problem. But anyway, so I fear, like you said, that we're going to need like a root and branch, So in a way, we're here to talk about whether we should decolonize education, but I think we kind of agree on that point. So
I think that's a perfect example of just how deep-seated the problem is, right? It can't just be enough to say, well, let's have a couple of Black History Month, or let's have, and in the schools, let's because this is the defense the government uses. Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, talking about the curriculum's not colonized because GCSE history, you can choose to do something about globalization, which is ridiculous. It's actually about the core idea, and the monarchy, industrial revolution, just the way that we understand the world. We understand it badly. So to decolonize, if we use that term, is just a sensible thing if you want to understand the world properly. Right?
Yeah, I do think maybe we need better language around this point to so that people really understand what it is we want to happen, because I think people get scared by those words sometimes. But like you say, I think and having recently read your book, which you've beautifully displayed behind you, The New Age of Empire, available now from all good bookshops. I think that it's I really am convinced, that this is like key to understanding the world today and understanding history. And I'm a historian, so I'm coming at it. And I've always, as a historian, you're always looking to the past to explain the present. But very often this kind of colonial history of ours, you know, we're not just ours, but, you know, of the whole West, you know, we're not, that's not, you know, and it's very much at the forefront in your analysis. And I think that, you know, whether it's at the forefront all the time, but it should certainly be at the forefront in quite a lot of the way. We can't really understand our world today, can we? Without thinking about through this lens.
Well, you can, right? Because that's what we do. So I guess you can make the argument it's possible. It's just incorrect, right? And I think that's the key thing. Think about somewhere like Britain, actually. I mean, Britain's only great because of empire. I mean, it's like this idea that Britain has this history that somehow predates empire is nonsense. It wasn't even a country. The Act of Union 1707, and a big part of the thing that glues it all together is empire, right? That there's lots of money to be made, and it's this collaborative enterprise, etc. And you think about something like the monarchy, which yes predates empire, but becomes something completely different. It's transformed through empire, like you said with Victoria. There's no think about the way that things are produced through industrial revolution, etc. There is no honest way to understand something like Britain or the West without understanding that long history of racism, slavery, colonialism, and also the continued present of it as well. Like, this hasn't really changed. It's just shifted a little bit. It looks a bit different, but if you look at the basic logic of it, that the white places, the West exploit the other parts of the world, they're still exactly the same as it was before.
Yeah, and I think if I remember rightly, part of the reason the Scots were up for the Act of Union in 1707 was that in the 1690s they tried and failed to set up their own colony in the Sound of Darien, and it had all gone horribly wrong. And they realised, you know, and then you find Scots at the forefront of the British Empire and all its projects. You know, if you go to Jamaica and look in the phone book, there are so many Scottish surnames, and that's just the start of it. I've been reading about colonial Bombay this week. And you know, there's so many Scots there as well, in the armed forces as well. That sort of, so yeah, and so I think but how can we do this then? What's the way forward?
See, that's the interesting question. As somebody with a Scottish surname, actually Andrews, so they just give the link to my former slave owners, right? I think that this is the problem, but this is where I guess you get. I'm maybe not in the same place as many of my colleagues on this one. Is I don't necessarily think you can decolonize the school curriculum or the universities. I mean, if you look at why this hasn't just happened randomly, it's not an accident that we have this really bad way of understanding the world. It's on purpose. So this is because what it does is it means we don't confront the reality of where we've got the wealth from and how we maintain it. So in some ways, I don't think it's ever going to be the case. You're going to get an honest assessment of this from the mainstream. And in many ways, like, we do Black studies, but Black studies is decolonized, if you like, but because it has a different root. It's community, it's been in existence. Black studies is new in the university, but not new in the country. At least 50-year history, which is a different kind of knowledge. That knowledge exists. The question that's being put really here is, can you really mainstream that knowledge? And to be honest, I'm not 100% certain you can.
Right. So for the people listening, can you sketch out a bit more about what Black studies is?
Yeah, I mean, simply is looking at the world through the experiences, perspectives, and contributions from Africa and the African diaspora. More specifically, it's saying that we have to do that in order to, how do we make things better? How do we improve? So there's a very practical element, activist element to it. And as I said, this isn't new. It's been around for a long time. In the UK, there's been the big thing the British Black Power movement did really in the UK was have this educational spaces. So all these books behind me were from like black bookshops. The bookshop movement was a big thing. The Saturday school movement, where we just taught kids ourselves, organizations, etc. So this knowledge is there. There's a reason it's not within the mainstream. And even though we put it into the university, I would still say that mostly what we're trying to do is to colonize the space of the university. I don't think we've changed the actual university. Even my university, but even my experiences in my university, is I just had to come out recently and say how bad it is, even in the place that's supposed to be progressive. So yeah, I'm just not sure it's that. I'm not sure you can change the system of what it is, because the system of what it is what it is for a reason, right?
Yeah, so let's talk a bit more about that, about sort of knowledge production in the university, and you know, what are the flaws there and what's going wrong?
Everything. No, so there's two flaws. One, the intellectual tradition in which the modern university is based on is just white supremacy, like deeply white supremacy. There's a chapter in the book, I'm White, Therefore I Am, you know, the Enlightenment thinkers like Kant, Rousseau, Locke, this idea of the emergence of science. I mean, this is so steeped in the idea of white supremacy, that white people can be rational, and the civilizing project. And that is still, if you look where we get the root of our knowledge from in the universities and it goes to schools, that's where it comes from, across all the social sciences, arts, humanities, disciplines, etc. And then the other thing which is really important is the conceit of that is it separates out knowledge from practice. The university becomes this elite, exclusive space. You know, you should listen to me because I'm a professor and I know best. That's nonsense. I mean, it's ridiculous. And it creates this complete disconnect between the general public and the elite academics, which you can see in class terms, gender terms, in all terms as well. So there's those two big problems with the university.
And obviously there's also the problem of who is in the university and who is doing the research and the teaching there.
Yeah. So that gets them reflected to who. I mean, even now, there's about 1% of academic staff in the UK are black. But if you got professors, I'm one of 140, I think, black professors. There's about 35 black female professors out of 20,000. I mean, it's really bad, right? So then when you think why it carries on and why it hasn't changed and why we're still doing the same things we've been doing, that really is why. And then, yeah, the experiences you have in these places are awful. I mean, we can talk about diversifying, but look, I've worked in university a long time. It's deeply uncomfortable because the structure of it is just institutional racism. And I think sometimes we think about unis as these progressive spaces. They're just as institutionally racist as the police force. And we should always expect the same kind of outcomes.
Yeah, and there was, I think it was a documentary on BBC Three recently about racism at a university that, you know, was pretty sobering. And I obviously read in the Independent about your own experiences this week as well, which is just, you know, again, like, unfortunately not that surprising. You know, and I was at Oxford and I read about my old college. You know, there were people saying that, you know, they get stopped at the door and sort of said, you know, are you a student? Like, being challenged just from like the way they look, and they're more likely to assume that they're kind of doing building work on site or something like, or turning up to well, in the documentary as well, they just assumed this guy was a drug dealer essentially.
Yeah, it's really bad. Honestly, until very recently, I would never go into the building at work without trousers, shoes, like without have a uniform. I'd even, like, if I was around the corner going into work just to get something quickly, I would go home and get changed because it was just so much hassle from security. That's somebody I'm pretty well known, probably one of the most well-known people in the building, but still getting treated like that because it's just so terrible. And then those stereotypes are still very much there. The way you have to exist through the space, it's not nice. It's not surprising though, because all these institutions are like that, to be honest.
Yeah, so it's like even physically getting into the door, getting into the space of the university is a challenge. And you know, again, as from the history perspective, the Royal Historical Society published a report on race in the history profession a couple of years ago, and again, it's the same story writ large. And you know, as far as I know, I think there are only 3 black history professors in the country, and only one of them is a woman, Olivette Otelli.
Sorry, who's the third? Who's that?
Hakima D at Chichester, and David Olusoga is a professor of public history at Manchester.
Ah, okay. They imported him in there. I don't think that counts. I'm not sure.
You don't think it counts? Yeah. A bit of academy elitism there.
No, I don't really shade. I actually this is not shade to David Olusoga, but there is I think there's a difference when you.
No, I know what you mean. And it actually feeds into what you're saying. As one of the things I think we're seeing now is that universities are trying to talk the talk. They're trying to look good, aren't they? They're trying to say that they're doing all the right things, and but you know, at their core, it's not quite working.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. So that's the thing. Like, you got this issue with professors, and there's a massive issue with the way that people are promoted, the way that people have been treated, the way that people have been for years and years and years and years. The response to that isn't then to go out and say, well, let's get high-profile people and put them in professorship. And again, it's nothing against, like, Olusoga's work's very good. It's nothing against that at all. But I think we can all accept that is not the way you deal with this problem. You deal with this problem structurally and say, well, actually, the lack of professors is about, I mean, even at my uni, which is 50%, more than 50% ethnic minority, my faculty is 60%. Undergraduate, masters, that drops precipitously. PhD is like 15%. And so you're seeing there's this massive issue with the pipeline. So you have to address that. You can't just import in people and say, well, look, our stats look better. But unfortunately, that is what universities have been, not just in this issue, but in lots and lots of ways. That's how they approach it, right? Cosmetically.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm more optimistic than you are in general, I think. But you know, I really would like to try and think about practical ways to try and solve it, at least improve the situation. And I think you're right to identify a pipeline, but I think that goes right back to primary school, if not nursery. And you know, I think we have to sort of, if we want more Black professors in 10 years' time, we need, or 10, 20 years' time, we need to be addressing this at every stage, you know. And I think you know, obviously there is some utility to hiring Black professors apart from their own intrinsic worth, but that they're you know, that then you're providing role models, and like people can see themselves in those roles. You're providing young people with something to aspire to in that sense, or like making it visible that this is a career, that path that they could choose. But I think there is optimism to me in the history sector and in schools, because there are increasingly teachers who, regardless of what the government is doing or clearly not doing in terms of changing the curriculum, you know, are taking it upon themselves to rewrite their what they're actually teaching in schools, rethink the way. And I think that, again, like a lot of the confusion about this is that people think you're going to kind of cut like you know, people willfully say, oh, they're going to cancel Shakespeare, which is just rubbish. But I think also it's not so much about what topics you put on the curriculum, it's about how you teach them and what questions you ask of that topic. And I think actually education, if we're talking about it really broadly, is about teaching people how to think, is like giving people the space to ask questions of whatever topic they're studying, that you know. And I think that you know, your work really helps me with that as well, sort of think, right, okay, well, how does that fit in, like what, you know. And I think what you were saying about Black studies, it's a different way of questioning the world, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's about really, it's a lens. What is Patricia Collins talks about Black feminist epistemology, and it's a standpoint. You just see the world differently, and then once once you have that lens, you just have to look at everything differently, and that's really important. And also more honestly, because the view from the bottom is always going to be better than the view from the top, right? In terms of understanding the way the structures work. I mean, one thing I would say, if we are thinking about decolonizing, we have to be honest and say it does probably mean taking some stuff out, right? Like Shakespeare's fine, but do we have to do so much Shakespeare? Like really, like there's so maybe we can just do a bit of Shakespeare and do something else. And then, but some of the stuff actually is damaging. So actually, one of the things before I wrote this book, I would have said enlightenment, whatever, teach it, contextualize it. But actually, it's so bad. I don't know why you would need Immanuel Kant. Honestly, you could just get rid of Immanuel Kant. Your life will be better if you get rid of Immanuel Kant. I didn't read Eddie Kant until very recently, like properly read Kant. It didn't help me understand the world. It really didn't. Like I actually feel I was better off because I didn't go through the Kantian training, which is deeply problematic. Some of these ideas actually do need to go. And I think we need to just be honest about it and say, no, there's no space for that.
Yeah, I think, I'm pleased. Well, quite pleased to reflect that I've never studied Kant, and I only really came to him at all, you know, through your work, but you know, through people saying, "Oh, well, have you noticed these incredibly racist views in his work?" So, and I think it's also about the hierarchy, isn't it? Of, you know, I think there's a tendency to think, right, we're going to teach our stuff first, and then maybe in your third year you can do a little module on what people were doing somewhere else, you know, and you know, and which I think needs to be turned on its head completely. So maybe if you were going to study Kant, you'd have to have studied Malcolm X first, and then I know Malcolm's your favorite person.
But no, Malcolm, honestly, Malcolm understand. You'd be better off listening to Malcolm than reading Kant. If you want to understand the world, you're actually better off doing it, I would argue. And this is, again, I really want to go back to the Ollie Sugar thing, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying he's not professor. Because actually, part of the big thing of what I always argue is that knowledge is better produced outside, actually, right? So, you know, we definitely shouldn't be saying, look, this internal way that we do things, that's the way to do things. 100% we shouldn't be doing it. And we should be acknowledging where knowledge is produced outside. I mean, that comment specifically was about trying to address this issue of professorship and what does that mean and what does the university have to do? And unfortunately, you've already seen what the universities are doing, and that's not helping that problem particularly.
So how do we? So are you saying you don't think it's possible for that knowledge produced outside the academy, for that knowledge produced in different ways to become mainstream?
No, probably not. I don't know.
If you really believe that, you wouldn't bother writing books and appearing on events like this to try and tell people about it.
I guess, I don't know. Maybe it can. No, okay. It's not impossible. No, okay. I'll give the Malcolm X answer because Malcolm's always right on everything, right? So Malcolm spent a lot of time talking broadly and said, look, it's the ballot or the bullet. Like the stuff's there, the arguments are there. This you can have it. What did he say? The one society has a chance to have a non-violent revolution. Just listen to people, right? It is possible. I'm just not optimistic it's going to happen. It's not impossible. I'm just not optimistic it's going to happen. And I think the more important thing is, using platforms, building stuff, writing stuff, so that we're doing the work that needs to be done. And yeah, if it does become mainstream, that's fine. But again, I don't think we can wait for that. I just don't think that's going to be. I don't think expecting the system to change is the way that we deal with these problems. We have to change. We have to actually change it ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And like again, in the kind of school curriculum argument, clearly. There's the black curriculum have been making great work, but they've been petitioning Gavin Williamson, and that is definitely head brick wall. But then the optimistic thing is that like there are networks of teachers, there are teaching conferences, there are people really making an effort to make those changes sort of on the ground, which I think is good. I'm wondering if we should start looking at some of these questions from the audience that are popping up. Because so somebody has said, what are the key decolonising questions we should be asking when reviewing postgraduate curricula? Are there any general questions regardless of academic discipline? So I suppose if we sort of tie that into what we were saying about questions that we ask of any topic, how would you formulate those questions? Do you think there are kind of subject-wide questions that we can?
Well, I think there are. I actually think you have to go to the root of all of these stuff. If you look at the disciplines, obviously I can't talk too much about the sciences, but we talk about humanities and social sciences. They're inadequate, right? I did my PhD in sociology. It was inadequate. We learned Marx, Durkheim, Weber, a few more. Like we just literally not. What I say, we just learned dead white men. It's really true because even the newer people we learned was like Bourdieu, right? Like Foucault. It's just all literally like if you just sit down and look at your curriculum and look at the stuff you're teaching as the core, as the canon, if it's just all white men, then there's a problem, right? So it is about saying, well, how do we find other stuff? How do we go outside the academy? How do we go outside the university to do that? And it is really about having a proper, honest look, because I've had quite a good history of looking at things like, I've been in psychology, been in sociology, dabbled in history now, gone into philosophy, and that. Just look at it. It's terrible. It needs to change, and it needs to center voices that aren't just those standard dominant voices.
Yeah, and I haven't done science since GCSE, but I do remember, there was this history teacher who said, "Oh, you're off to study the history of science then." And because it's like, right, we're going to learn about Newton, then we're going to learn about Einstein, with lots of people in between. But and I think I've got an anecdote that I think you'll enjoy, which is when I started my history degree at Oxford, the very first lecture was a history of the history degree at Oxford. Oh, wow. And I'm pretty sure they said that because originally, historically, they would have done theology, then they kind of started classics, Roman, Latin and Greek, but then when they formulated their history degree, I think in the sort of latter 19th century, they said in order to train people who were going out to administer the empire. They literally said that, that like a lot of the Indian civil service, they needed to know a bit of history before they went out and carried on.
Wow. Yeah, no way.
Same way they said they designed the English literature degree because women couldn't be expected to start to understand Latin and Greek. So,
no, but that's the intellectual traditions we're still in, right? Like it's awful. You need to start again, honestly. Like this, and even the way we think about science. Actually, in the book, there's a bit about this. Like I remember being taught, was it Archimedes discovered pi, That's complete nonsense. Like, we have the pyramids. Like, you can see the pyramids, which are like thousands of years before, which clearly have used pie in their creation. And we're telling you some Greek person came up with pie. And this thing is true, right? Well, even the history of science is the way they whitewashed and wrote out all the Arabic scientists. And it's just really, actually look at the way that we think knowledge was produced, scientific knowledge was produced, is completely incorrect and completely whitewashed. Really.
Yeah, actually, I think because this audience as well is quite techie. I mean, tell them about the origin of the word algorithm.
Yeah, I was totally surprised. This is news to me. Algorithm comes from Al-Khwarizmi, who was I want to say 11th century Persian philosopher. The century could be wrong, but literally that's where algorithm comes from. This is one of the things we use all the time nowadays, and that was complete news to me when I was reading the book. It's called The Map of Knowledge by Violet Moller, and there's just loads of things like that. Even infinity. So the idea of infinity. Western science, Europeans couldn't grasp this until relatively recently, like 18th century. It was actually the idea of infinity was so taboo. Like, you would be like, in the 4th century, they were essentially lynching people for bringing up infinity. Whereas in African traditions, you can actually see patterns of infinity for centuries, right? Like, just there. Like, it's this idea that Europe is a place that produced knowledge and science is just wrong. Europe certainly was important, but it drew on lots and lots of other historical legacies. It was a combination of different things, but we've basically been given this lie that it all came from Europe and Europe's great and isn't the West wonderful.
I think one of the problems is the kind of European written records. As a historian, you've got a lot of things, Mr. Algorithm wrote it down here, whereas our evidence, and forgive me if I'm wrong, our evidence for other knowledge traditions, it doesn't come in that format that the European scholars were kind of expecting and validated. And I found this great in Toby Green's History of West Africa, A Fistful of Shells, and combating that Africa has no history kind of malign misunderstanding. And sort of looking at, archaeological history, oral history, and there's so many other ways of kind of accessing knowledge that we're cutting ourselves off from if we only rely on the written record.
Yeah, and that is what essentially, but even the written record is so distorted anyway, because once, so essentially what the Greeks did was write things down, and this is why we have this Greek, because it's written down, right? And then before the West emerges, so 1492, the West kind of is when the West emerges. Before then, it's the Arab world which is dominant by a far distance. Arabic is a dominant language. There's more books in like one library in where was it, in Baghdad, than in all of Europe put together. Like, Arabs really are ahead of everywhere. It's where you get Al-Khwarizmi from, etc. And when Spain takes over, Spain beats the Moors, and they literally destroy millions of Arabic books, rewrite all the stuff into Latin. Which is why actually you have to kind of give some of the Enlightenment thinkers a pass, I guess, because when they're reading this stuff with they change the names to Latin names. They probably genuinely think that this all came from Greece and Rome, etc. But actually, that was a process of erasing millions of things and change and actually whitewashing. So they actually whitewashed the intellectual record, and that's the record we still use.
And when we think about when I was a kid, Timbuktu was an evocation of somewhere very far away and kind of remote and strange. And again, it was a massive university city, wasn't it?
Yeah, Timbuktu was a huge library, massive university, but backwards. And
so again, the audience, I think there's a lot of tech knowledge in the audience, and they're interested. They're asking the questions now about the growth of algorithms and automation being used to find, curate, and interrogate historical materials. Could we start trying to decolonize data and research methods, especially digital ones? And can tech create a new education system?
I think so. On the one hand, possibly, right? So in fact, one of the ways, even thinking about non-mainstream, but even if you take my negative, the schools aren't going to change approach, which who knows, right? There is now so many other ways to teach, like this, for example, online platforms. Like when my family, all these books behind me, they were like no books. Like my parents were involved in literally going to America, finding these books and importing them themselves, right? Like, it was so hard to get knowledge that there was kind of no way this would break into the mainstream. Whereas now, because with podcasts and all this digital stuff, it's a much more possibility for that to happen, certainly. The only thing I would warn against all the time with this is if you look at who's leading the new technologies and algorithms and database, it's the same people who created all the problems. So although there's a possibility that this offers a different future, the reality is it probably doesn't, right? Because of just how everything is still controlled by the people in power and still want. And this is the key thing I would argue here is the same logic of Western imperialism that you can exploit black and brown life to progress is still the same logic now. And the same people that run all these companies and this data, they depend on that logic.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd want to throw the question back to the audience. Are you in tech? Do you have an idea? Do you have a solution? Let us know, please, because we'd like to hear it. But like, yeah, as you say, we need to think about decolonizing all of our industries and institutions. You know, and again, you know, again, I'm reminded of Caroline Criado Perez's book Invisible Women, because again with the gender lens on, you know, the world was designed by men for men, which is why I can never reach the highest shelf in the cupboard. And I'm more likely to die in a car accident because crash test dummies are all man-shaped. You know, and actually even with the COVID vaccine, I got vaccinated earlier on because I had gestational diabetes. But that's only affects you when you're pregnant. And I'm pretty sure a man programmed the algorithm and put gestational diabetes in the same box as all the other diabetes. And so I got up the queue, you know. But so let's see now. There's one more question here. Does the Culture Secretary's retain and explain mantra for museum collections help or inform the decolonising the curriculum debate?
Is that regarding we're not giving stuff back, basically? I
think that might be a rhetorical question. I actually heard you talk about museums in an event last year, I think. You know, museums are another like colonial space, again, you know, literally full of the loot of empire. Yeah, obviously the Benin bronzes, but so much, you know, I was just looking at, again, I've been reading about India, and Tipu Sultan's, you know, helmet that he wore into battle is sitting there in the National Army Museum in London, as is like so much of his other stuff. And you know, and what's really annoying is when these things are, well, really annoying, but they're not even on display half the time, they're in storage. So this whole argument of like, oh, they're in London, so many more people will see them than if you sent them to Timbuktu.
No, it's really good. There's what did Malcolm Gladwell, who's really problematic for lots of reasons, but Malcolm Gladwell did this a discussion about this on one of his podcasts, and he compared the museums to Smaug, the dragon in The Hobbit, who just sits on all this wealth. He doesn't really do anything with it, doesn't need it, he's just sitting on it and just defended it. And that's what you have these places. Most of the stuff isn't on display, it's just in a cupboard somewhere, literally. And he told this story about the Met Museum in New York, where the guy was like, we've got the head of the Met was like, we've got an expert on Muslim rugs, and he can't even tell you what rugs we have because we just have them all in a cupboard. And it's like, well, what are you doing, right? That's the perfect example of entitlement. I mean, look, this is stolen property. We actually do have laws about this, you know, Proceeds of Crime Act, you just give it back. This isn't complicated, but it shows you the conceit. And even if you just walk into a museum, it shows. I don't go to museums, I'll be honest, I don't go to museums. I'm actually working on a project called Don't Settle, where we're working with young people who are trying to like decolonize museum space. And I still haven't gone to the museums because they're terrible. And whites, they literally are just odes to white supremacy. And that's one of the things we'd have to rethink completely if we were saying, well, how do you decolonize something like that?
Because I think museums are also, you know, obviously really important in terms of education, because I mean, when we define decolonizing, we didn't necessarily define education. And I think people think university, school, but then how do we educate the older people? Like, how do we educate people who are over 25 and, you know, might actually be, you know, the decision makers in our society as well? And hopefully they've listened to this session, but also, you know, there's you know, you know, I think museums are a space where, again, if one were able to, you know, you could capture the imagination of, you know, the broader public. And I think there are examples where people are, at least, you know, there are certainly lots of people trying. Yeah, there's even an organization called Museum Detox, and you know, people doing tours, and you know, and I think again, I want to, you know, end on a note of optimism. and I think there are digital opportunities, online opportunities for education, as you're saying, and people can do online exhibitions, and even if these things are all in storerooms, sometimes they're on the website, so you can kind of link and show. But again, there's a inequality to that as well, because we like to think of the internet as being democratic, but in many parts of the world, if you don't have an internet connection, if you don't have the energy generators necessary to keep the internet going, it's just as inaccessible as it always was.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not trying to be negative. What I'm trying to say is that once we understand the systems just aren't going to change, then we'll understand that we need to do different stuff. And I think museums are a perfect example, schools are a perfect example. I'm someone I went through the British school system. I was taught that the Industrial Revolution wasn't important to slavery, but I just taught the same stuff you were taught. The difference is I had British Black Power. I had alternative spaces. I had lots of places to go and nourish myself. And I've never relied on the schools. This is something we learned early on in community. You just can't rely on these places. We have to go and build stuff elsewhere, and that's where we get our education from. And that's possible. And I think that is, for me, what we should really be trying to do. How do we build these alternative spaces? How can we build alternative education? How can we do something that's different to the museums? And that's where we're going to find the critical education that we need, I think.
Yeah, and I hope we can take inspiration from all of that and keep working to try and change things, even though, as you say, it is a very difficult, very big task. But I hope everyone listening has been thinking about how they personally can do something, because I think it takes everybody to think, what can I do? And work together. On that note, somebody has asked, is there a way to contact us after the session? I'm supporting a highly related project on changing education on colonialism. So I would have said the easiest way to contact us might be on Twitter, would you say? Or, I'm on @Miranda Kaufmann. You're @Kehinde _Andrews. But yeah, with that's probably the easiest way to connect in this digital world. And
I have a university email, you can still email me. Which is kehinde.andrews@bcu.ac.uk. As long as I still got a job, you can still email me.
Yeah, you can contact me via my website, www.mirandakaufmann.com as well. So yeah, get in touch. Let us know. Keep this discussion going.